Hey there, welcome to my channel. In this video, we're going to look at another one of your required topics for the AP government curriculum, namely Cold War conflicts from 1947 to 1991. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. Okay, so before we talk about specific conflicts, we need to understand the broader context in which those conflicts were fought, and that would be the context of the Cold War. If you don't remember what the Cold War was, well, here's a quick review. The Cold War was the state of hostility that existed between the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, and it lasted roughly from the end of World War II in 1945 until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The two sides were engaged in an ideological struggle. The US championed democracy and capitalism, whereas the Soviet Union championed communism. Since both of these ideologies were diametrically opposed to one another, it's not surprising that these two superpowers didn't get along. Now, during the Cold War, there were times when the two superpowers came close to open warfare with each other, like during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But for the most part, the battles between the two were fought by proxy. What do I mean by that? Well, instead of fighting each other directly, they fought by supporting opposing sides in various conflicts around the world. And these conflicts were all characterized by an arms race, meaning both sides sought to increase their supply of weapons to gain an advantage over the other. There were two major arms races that defined the Cold War: the nuclear arms race and the space race. The nuclear arms race began in 1945, when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which led to Japan's unconditional surrender and the end of World War II. After that, the Soviet Union began developing their own nuclear weapon and successfully tested one in 1949, which ended the United States' monopoly on that particular form of warfare. And just like the arms race to acquire nuclear weapons, there was also a race to explore outer space. This is what's known as the space race. It began in the late 1950s as the Soviets and Americans competed against each other to achieve significant milestones in rocket technology, satellites, and eventually human spaceflight. Both sides believed that whoever achieved these milestones first had bragging rights and a technological advantage over the other. All right, now that you have a clear picture of the context surrounding Cold War conflicts, let's talk about 3 of them specifically. First up, we have the Korean War. So the Korean Peninsula had been occupied by Japan until the end of World War II, and then it was split into 2 zones of occupation, the North and the South. The North was occupied by the Soviet Union and became a communist dictatorship under Kim Il-sung. The South was occupied by the United States and became a democratic republic under Syngman Rhee in 1950. Kim Il-sung decided he wanted to unify the peninsula under communist rule, and with the aid of the Soviet Union he invaded the South. The United States and its allies came to the defense of South Korea, and a stalemate developed that ended with a truce in 1953. The result of the war was that Korea remained divided, though the 38th parallel had become the de facto border. The significance of the Korean War for the purposes of this video is that it was the first major conflict of the Cold War. Before this, the US had largely followed a policy of containment in which they would use economic and military means to keep communism from spreading. But with the outbreak of the Korean War, the US was fighting a hot war against communism for the first time, and that meant that the Cold War had officially begun. Okay, next up, let's talk about the Vietnam War. The French had held control of Vietnam as part of their colonial empire. But after the Japanese took over in World War II, the country was in chaos. Following the end of the war, the Vietnamese people wanted independence from both the French and the United States. But the US saw Vietnam as a key domino in the effort to contain the spread of communism. So they provided massive amounts of military and economic aid to the South Vietnamese government. Of course, the North was supported by the communists, and soon the US found itself mired in a nasty and protracted conflict with no clear way to victory. Eventually, in 1973, the US withdrew from the conflict, and the North and South were unified under communist rule in 1976. Now, the reasons why the US got involved in this conflict are complicated, but suffice it to say that the overall goal was still to contain the spread of communism. Additionally, the conflict became increasingly unpopular with Americans because the purpose of the war was never clearly defined, and this led to massive anti-war protests. Eventually, President Richard Nixon ended US involvement, and the war would end shortly after his resignation. The legacy of the Vietnam War is that it left the American public deeply cynical about the role of the United States in world affairs, which set the stage for the foreign policy of the next several decades. Okay, lastly, we have the conflict in Afghanistan. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was rooted in the internal conflicts within that country. There were several different factions vying for power, and the communists were one of them. But as the communists gained power, the Soviet Union feared that they would align themselves with the United States and its allies, so the Soviets invaded to prevent that from happening. Unfortunately for the Soviets, the Afghan people were able to wage a successful guerrilla war against the occupying forces, and the Soviets struggled to make any real gains against the Afghans. Moreover, the United States took every opportunity to supply the Afghans with weapons through Pakistan in order to bleed the Soviets. We're talking about supplying them with Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that proved highly effective against the Soviet helicopters and other aircraft. Anyway, after 10 years of conflict, the Soviets had suffered more than 10,000 casualties and had wasted a ton of resources, so they packed it in and left Afghanistan in 1989. The significance of this conflict is that it marked the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. The war drained their resources and contributed heavily to the collapse of the economy. That, coupled with internal reform movements and the collapse of communism throughout Eastern Europe, led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Okay, that's what you need to know about Cold War conflicts from 1947 to 1991. Click right over here to grab a view packet. If you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, I've got videos on all the other required topics right here. So click away if that's something that you're into. Subscribe if you want me to keep making these videos, and I shall surely oblige. Signing out.